This is a presentation of the WELS Historical Institute and Friends of the Salem Landmark Church. Welcome to the 2011 Summer Series of Great Leaders of the Past, showing God's grace in the history of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, featuring first of all Friedrich Wyneken, his pioneer mission work in the founding of Lutheran synods in the Midwest, with historical background and insights by Dr. John Brug, professor at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary in Mequon. Presented in the Salem Landmark Church, birthplace of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod in 1850, currently being restored to its original likeness.
I want to welcome you all to our presentation today, and on behalf of the WELS Historical Institute and the Friends of the Landmark Church, my name is Dan Nomenson. I'm the Vice President of the WELS Historical Institute, and we're just delighted to have everyone here today. All right, I'm going to introduce Professor Brug here from Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. Of course, most of us know Professor Brug. We thank him very much for coming, and he's going to talk about Friedrich Wyneken. Let's give Professor Brug a very warm welcome.
This, I don't know quite what we call this presentation, discussion, book report. It's all of those things kind of together. And of course, there's a couple interesting questions. One question you can think about is what states were important in the founding of the Missouri Synod? And Missouri isn't necessarily the right or only main answer. And who is most important? Of course, without doubt, Walther, but there's a lot of other things to think about. The other question is, whoever this guy is, I think everybody pretty much now anglicizes him as Wyneken. You still hear a few diehards down in Indiana and some of his relatives in the WELS who will insist it's Wyneken. And that's, of course, the case with a lot of our German names. I think for case of simplicity, we'll call him Wyneken. I said that this is partly a book report, and all the professors here are disqualified. But how many of you have this book or know this book? If you don't, you should probably get it. It's called At the Home and the House of Our Fathers, and it's really the first really big English collection, other than some of the Missouri Synod collections on Walther, that brings out many documents from the early years of the Missouri Synod. It's also very interesting if you like contemporary Lutheranism, because the man who wrote it, I'll call him, was the outsider candidate for president of the Missouri Synod when he wrote this, and it was not published by Concordia. Now he's the president of the Missouri Synod, and I've been told it's now being published by Concordia in the second edition, so I don't know. The good thing about it is it's about $20. That hardly covers postage and handling. And so it's really about the four presidents of the Missouri Synod who were born in Germany. Kind of the golden years, you could say, a great happening in American Lutheranism. I think we can really say the early growth of the Missouri Synod was the greatest thing that happened to Lutheranism since the days of Luther and the Confessors. I don't think there's anything else that would match that. So the House of Our Fathers are these four presidents of the Missouri Synod, of which Wyneken was one. And his writings, of course, are not particularly well known. And this book brings them to light a little bit. And I'm going to kind of do two things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the man. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the writings reveal about him. But then, of course, the question of interest to us is, other than being great for Lutheranism, which we, of course, like, what did he have to do with the Wisconsin Synod? And what is his role and his connection? What role did he play in the development of relationships between the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod? I'm going to follow the paper I gave you relatively closely. At first I was just going to do an outline, but I thought it might be better if you have something you can kind of keep as a reference, and so I'll follow it fairly closely. The headings kind of just tell you a couple things. These four presidents, there was a little bit about them in the Wisconsin Lutheran Quarterly. Besides the journal, of course, of the Historical Society, the other journal that all history buffs and WELS buffs should subscribe to is Wisconsin Lutheran Quarterly, whether they are pastors or lay people. They're sometimes some Hebrew and Greek in the Bible articles and that, but you'll find many historical things in there also that would be of interest. And I mentioned the connection with this book, which I don't know if it's still being marketed in both ways, maybe you know, but if Concordia is still selling it for $20, which was what it was being sold for, as I said, that hardly covers postage and handling. And anybody interested in the history of the Lutheran Church and the teachings of the Lutheran Church would really enjoy working your way through this book. Maybe it's big enough to last you all winter and give you some things to read. So I'd encourage you to do that. So I'm going to follow fairly closely with what I gave to you here. Missouri Synod, of course, is sort of contemporary with the start of the WELS, late 1840s. They had been there, of course, for almost a decade or so at that time. What a lot of people don't realize as much is that the people who came with Walther, or that Walther came with, whichever way you'd like to put it, really were not like the big bulk of the Missouri Synod in their early years, but the people who came from Michigan and Indiana and other places really were a significant number of the pastors, and the men who came also partly through Wyneken's influence were rather important in that development. It was a big step when the Saxons from Missouri got in contact with these other people. It was a great thing for Lutheranism. First paragraph simply is pretty straightforward. He was a colleague of Walther. He played a key role in the foundation of the Missouri Synod, although technically he wasn't actually part of it per se, according to the book. What he really contributed was his great role in strengthening the flow of pastors to America through the appeals and so on that he made. And the other thing that he's really known for, the Missouri Synod, of course, was known for its great mission zeal. It was not that Walther didn't have mission zeal, but many people really credit Wyneken for kind of the mission spirit and a lot of the attitude toward mission spirit. I'll read you a quotation later about it. It's just incredible, the growth of confessional Lutheranism that took place, you know, pretty much from Ohio through the Dakotas and beyond, and even into Canada, through the sacrifices that the early missionaries of the Missouri Synod made. In the later part of the book, there's a lot of stuff about what the pastors did to take the gospel to the prairies, to the Dakotas, and even up into Canada. It's really a remarkable story. I guess if you look at our background too, and the Missouri Synod, we can say something we maybe don't say too often: thank God for pietism. I've experienced this a lot in Scandinavia too. I mean, there are some weaknesses and so on that pietism had, but in many ways it was in the pietistic societies and in the families of the pietistic societies that the gospel really lived on. Certainly the background my grandfather came from had a good dose of that in the German Russians. The earliest fathers of the Wisconsin Synod, whether you want to call it pietism, awakening, or whatever, the way the faith was kept alive, in some cases you could almost say in spite of the organized church. And it wasn't so much the clergy, but it was the people that were keeping it alive.
The definition of pietism?
Well, we say that it's kind of like an excess of, pietism is kind of excessive focus on our sanctification rather than our justification, if you want to say it in one sentence. And piety is very good, but when your piety and what you are doing kind of comes a little bit to the fore. In Scandinavia, the pietism is really pretty good and pretty Lutheran. They kept a strong focus on justification. Also saying that some of the doctrines, if we are agreed with the main doctrines, we're okay, and that we don't need to agree with all. So that's the background. He was very zealous for missions. I guess we could say that's kind of a trait of pietism too, a good trait. Very zealous for missions, but he wasn't really fully a confessional Lutheran early on in his career. And that's kind of reflected in the fact he came to Baltimore, which is kind of interesting to me because that's also where my grandfather entered America. So we always think of New York and Ellis Island and all these things, but there were a significant number of Lutherans that came through New Orleans and through Baltimore also. And notice the word I highlighted there in that paragraph. He was a great traveling missionary, but his call was really to gather Protestants in the frontier areas, not necessarily to be distinctly Lutheran. Even the history of this congregation and this area, that tension or whatever you want to call it, was certainly part of the issue. And so Fort Wayne, Indiana became kind of his base. There was another big base, important base, also up in Michigan, of pastors that became an important and critical part of the Missouri Synod. Probably the great contribution he made is this so-called note roof. He was distressed by the conditions on the frontier, the sheep without a shepherd, and so he made strong appeals that there was a great need for pastors to gather the people that were scattered on the frontier. Some people, like the people in Missouri, came to America for religious reasons. Many of them probably weren't that great of church members back in Germany either, of the ones that were gathered in the frontier. There were some very pious families, but it's not like they just moved a confessional church over here. I think it's very honest to say that they built a confessional church. Out of some of the building material were people that were becoming confessional Lutherans, including some of the pastors themselves. The other great man who should get a lot of attention, but kind of a tragic story, we can't talk about it today, is Leah. Kind of almost in exile, I would say, in Germany. Keep him out in the little village where he can't do too much damage. Not really in always good standing with the church, but a great trainer, I should say, of pastors and even deaconesses for the Lutheran Church. And he sent many, many men. It's a sad story because eventually there had to be a parting of the ways between him and Walther. But of the 5 men that contributed the most to the growth of the Lutheran Church in America, the confessional Lutheran Church, even though he never really came here, I think it would be pretty hard not to have him somewhere in the list. So his great contributions are often lost. There were some problems with some areas of his doctrine, but he certainly contributed a great deal. And so the men that Leah sent, most of them ultimately ended up in connection with the Missouri Synod and not with him. The other thing is he became more confessional himself, and I think probably a fair part of that, the historians can debate it. I think his contact with Leah was certainly a part of that Leah was a good influence on him and made him realize more the kind of things he said later in his life, that yes, the gospel and justification has the heart of it, but doctrine is very important, and we need to be concerned about doctrine. And the evolution, if you want to call it that, the development which Wyneken made during his ministry is a great example and a great story of what was happening to American Lutheranism. He plays a great role in Lutheran education and pastor training here in America. They realized they couldn't depend on Europe forever. Not so much that he directly did this, but they do list him in the book as a founder of the Fort Wayne Seminary, the Springfield Seminary in the Missouri Synod. Technically he wasn't, but he kind of did the groundwork and the people he brought and the early work he did in Fort Wayne, and so they list him as a founder of the Missouri Synod and a founder of the Missouri Synod Seminary system. Technically, in the narrowest sense of the word, he was probably not either, but in reality he was, because of the work that he did that made the foundations possible. He became president in 1850 and served for 14 years. This was the time they were beginning to get worried about a problem. The big problem they had plenty of people attacking them, of course. The big problem they had is they were getting too big too fast. And they loved the fact that they could have all the pastors meet together. And now when they start breaking up into districts, they had a real struggle with, are we still going to be close to each other? How will we preserve our unity? And one of his first presidential addresses in the book is considerably about that topic. And so he had great joy to see some of the most fabulous church growth, in the good sense of the term, that ever was experienced by the Lutheran Church. The closing of the biographical section is the last paragraph on page 1, and I'm just going to read that. In reporting his death in Der Lutheraner in May 15th, 1876, Walther described him as a highly gifted spirit, a truly evangelical preacher, a pastor experienced in the school of spiritual struggles. We're going to hear more about that. A fearless witness of pure truth, an avid warrior for the same, Probably wouldn't have said that about him at the start of his ministry. A faithful guardian of the church, a man without deception whose entire being bore the mark of honesty, an opponent of all lies and hypocrisy, a true Nathaniel, in short, a true Christian and a faithful servant of the Lord, who recognized in humility only his weaknesses, not his strength. For a multitude of preachers and laity, he was a model. For thousands, he was a spiritual father, and for whole areas of America, that he was their apostle. That's quite a high compliment of praise, I think, that last one. For whole areas of America, he was their apostle, the one that brought the gospel to them. Maybe the historians also would like to argue about this. I think you could make a good case for arguing that he was the third most important man in the growth of real confessional Lutheranism in America. You don't often hear him praised so much. Walther and, of course, Muhlenberg, who was important in the early growth of Lutheranism in the East. The Missouri Synod includes some of its founding fathers in their catalog of saints, not quite in the old traditional sense, but he is listed in the catalog of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod as having a day devoted to his memory, which is May 4th. So a very interesting and important and somewhat overlooked character. That's kind of the biographical part, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the man is reflected in his writings and in his sermons, but I'll maybe pause there. I don't know much more than this about his biography. You have a couple biographies at the bottom there. Online, of course, you can find brief biographies, but is he worthy of the ranking of being certainly in the top 5 of important men for the history of confessional Lutheranism in America? I think he probably is. Any comments up to here? Okay, then the second part relates more to his writings. And I'm going to look at other writings also besides his sermons. A very big and important thing in this book, there's almost 100 pages, which is another whole story and relates also to fellowship and many other issues. There's almost 100 pages of translation on a trip that he and Walther made to Europe to gather support from the confessional Lutherans that were there. The problem was the confessional Lutherans in Europe were not in confessional churches. And so the same kind of issues that we had that eventually led us to realize we had to go our separate way from some of the mission societies we were working with. Sometimes the Missouri Synod was a little hard on us because of that, but perhaps they should have not been quite as hard if, like 10 years before, they were in exactly the same position and went through exactly some of the same struggles. We can't talk about that story this morning, but they had the issue too. When do we stop taking money? Can we take money from this church? And sometimes they said, well, we have been, but I guess maybe now is time for us to stop. And so that's a whole interesting story in and of itself that goes above and beyond what we can talk about here. So they had to resolve their relationships with the churches in Europe. A very interesting point both about the life of Walther and Wyneken and the letters they write to each other, which are maybe some of the most revealing, is the tremendous burden they had. Maybe it was partly already their personalities. They had hard driving personalities, zealous personalities that didn't know when to rest, but both of them regularly had breakdowns and other serious problems with their health because of the great burdens they had. And so Walther would write something to Wyneken when Wyneken was really down, both physically and emotionally, and then vice versa, it would go back the other way. So the tremendous burdens they had, especially also some of the tremendous physical burdens that some of the frontier pastors had as they struggled to take the gospel under very difficult conditions. In many ways, with the climate differences, probably conditions every bit as bad or harsh as those the Apostle Paul had faced on his many journeys. Even just getting across the ocean, not all of them made it, and the hard conditions on which they traveled in the American frontier, especially before the railroads, they made great sacrifices. So I'd like to point out a couple things to you in their writings, and the letters are some of the more interesting ones, but the trials that these two men had and the way they spoke to each other and encouraged one another are quite a story and quite moving in and of themselves. The first one I'm going to read is a part that has to do with one of the breakdowns, mostly physical, but at times they were also emotional and exhaustion that the men had. And so Walther is writing to Wyneken when Wyneken is in a period where his health and his ability to work, it's about 10 years before his death, but he has spent about 25 years of hard work on the American frontier, often under difficult conditions. And this is what Walther says to him. I thank God again to hear, dear brother, that our dear God, who has never been pleased to place you in a bed of roses in this world, has once again laid you in the midst of the thorns. So he said, I don't think God's plan forever for you was that you would have an easy life. And now you're in the thorns as you maybe haven't been before. You must be confined to your room, and you have to struggle to write even a few lines. And so for you the day has come, and of which we, according to Scripture, say, they please me not. He's referring to Ecclesiastes. That such days have appeared so early in your life is certainly no wonder. God gave you the great grace in the days of your full power of body and soul to be able to forsake everything that is agreeable to men and so necessary for strengthening and preserving according to body and soul. And now it's no wonder that you are beginning to see the natural consequences of a life full of work, hardships, worry, concern, anxiety, and 1,000 other tribulations. But my dear Wyneken, recognize also with thanks that your miserable body and your mind, so often sunk in melancholy, are nothing but the marks of the Lord Jesus Christ, by which you are adorned. Indeed, I am very confident it is appropriate to sing the hymn of consolation to you. I shall not die but live and recount the deeds of the Lord. That's Psalm 118, and Luther wrote an Easter composition about that. If the days of your life are coming to a close, compared to millions, you have had the grace to live a life that has done great harm to the kingdom of the devil, death and lies, and you have won many souls for the Lord Jesus Christ. And he goes on in similar veins through other letters which they exchanged. It happened the other way very frequently also, that when Walther was in one of his periodic, we'll say, downslide that at times prevented him from doing his work, Wyneken was very complimentary also in helping him. And so the love and appreciation they had for each other, although in many ways they were very different people, working with Walther and Luther, I'd imagine, was not always the easiest job in the world. And at times, Wyneken is going to refer to the difficulties that sometimes rose because they had such different views of many things, and we'll come to that in just a couple of minutes. Another one that has to deal more with the health issue, though, is near the end of the period. Wyneken writes to Walther about things like depression and difficulties and endurance for the faith. And we'll deal also with that one in a minute. Here he talks about writing to Walther because he feels there's been a major falling out between them. This is shortly before the other. And he feels he's gotten over it in his heart, the estrangement, but he wonders whether Walther has or not. And so he deals with the matter also and talks about how he feels his health also is involved in this. And he says, the matter stirred up between us by the devil is dead, finished, buried, I hope to God. But should you, my dear Walther, note something in my demeanor against you that gives you pause to think that perhaps the matter still troubles me, do not believe it, but bring the matter openly to me. From the time I was a young man, as far back as I can remember, into my earliest childhood, I have suffered horribly from melancholy and hypochondria. Now in my old age, these physical weaknesses again reveal things I already suffered as a child. For instance, asthma. And so also with my physical nature, how should I describe it? this hypochondria, I don't think it's necessarily in the technical sense that we use it today, overcomes me in spite of the fact that I continuously fight against it. And so he's saying, maybe the physical burdens the both of us bear, all those pressures and everything, have been partly something the devil has tried to use to alienate us from each other. Wyneken probably had an ability to let things go more quickly maybe than Walther did. And so that the health and the pressures they faced were part of the issue. And what was it that he thought was maybe the thing that Walther was mad at him for, or that Walther felt he was untrustworthy or something like that? This is especially interesting to us because it comes to the point that how does he connect with the Wisconsin Synod? And I think what we can say, we have somewhat limited evidence, but he was maybe the voice that most said, we're being too hard on the Wisconsin Synod and we're not giving them enough credit, and maybe we're judging them a little too harshly, and if we behaved a little better, maybe things would have gone a little better. And I think some of our people too, Walther was very evangelical, but maybe there too, a lesson for the church is, do external circumstances sometimes color your relationships? And in many cases there were kind of clashes between WELS parishes and Missouri parishes. And you can read that Walther was so very patient with the kind of weak Lutherans in Germany. He at times was not so patient with the weak Lutherans that were closer at the door, at least at a certain point. But anyway, I think this is the part of the writings that are maybe of most interest to us. It's in the same letter, and whether the thing the devil put between them was something different, or whether this was at the heart of it, that Walther was beginning to suspect, yeah, that guy, he kind of started out as a pietist and still kind of a little weak. And so he goes on to the issue of whether he was a real confessional Lutheran or not, and whether Walther was fully confident he was. And so whether Walther had said these things or whether he's imagining them, it's very interesting in either way. He said, there are 2 points in your kind letter to which I would like to reply for clarification, to avoid misunderstanding. The first is that you are of the opinion, and this is in quotation marks, so Walther must have said this to him, you are of the opinion that I may no longer be pleased by the doctrinal rigorousness advocated by you. Said, so you're saying I don't really care about doctrine as much as you do, and I don't want to be that rigorous in doctrine. I am not aware that in this regard a change has taken place in me. On the contrary, the longer and the more I have suffered under my heavy spiritual afflictions, I have experienced in a practical way the necessity and importance of pure doctrine, since every doctrine is connected with justification and supports it. Indeed, proceeds from it, as from the center of the faith, and leads back to it. I have found in this doctrine my only stay in the midst of my difficulties. Thus, every doctrine becomes all the more significant for me for the sake of the consolation I seek. Nevertheless, it is possible I cannot always see the consequences of derived doctrines, when others can see such derived doctrines flowing from this or that dogma of a certain word of Scripture. It's interesting because that's kind of a topic of discussion today. Can we, by reason and analogy, kind of set forward doctrines that are not particularly in Scripture? And Wyneken says, I'm not a dogmatician. I admit I'm not good at that. If it's not in Scripture, I have trouble seeing it. That's not necessarily a weakness. I also see that others who do not recognize how it follows out of necessity of the preceding dogma. When I see that falsely deduced teachings are rigorously expressed and advocated and drilled into the conscience, my entire inner being turns away from it. He says if we start making a condition of fellowship or judging people on secondary things. I don't know what he's thinking about here. It would be things like maybe all insurance is a sin, those kind of things that would be conclusions drawn. He said when we rigorously push that, he said, I admit I don't go along with that, but it's not the doctrines that I'm against. This is so also in part because according to my entire natural inclination, I am not given to tolerate any sort of coercion, but also in part because of my terrible trials with conscience. I must with all my power guard against any force aside from that which I clearly recognize to be the Word of God. He said if one test is, do I follow synod royalty? He said, no, I can't do that. That's not something that I am capable of doing. Then he gets to his second point, which he admits had been a source of problems. Then I am, as you also know, against the form and the manner in which controversy with our opponents is often carried out. He said, I'm not against the doctrines we're fighting for, but I'm somewhat against the form and the manner we do this. And also, and this is in italics in the original, according to my opinion, we deal too much with the personal circumstances, frictions that arise between us and our opponents. And we demonstrate a level of irritation and touchiness, which according to, and again italicizes, my view, is not fitting for us. That was the earlier case with Grabau, and now with Wisconsin, Iowa, etc. So he says, I think I agree with everything we say they need to do, but I don't agree with that we've been treating them exactly right. And then he goes on to talk about this. It always seems to me that we could certainly drive the matter in a somewhat loftier manner, not being so petty, perhaps dealing more with the matter itself. As it is, we make people arrogant if we devote too much attention to them. And then the dog on the leash learns to eat leather. I'll talk about what he means by that, I think, in a minute. We make these chaps audacious by often insignificant contacts. I think what he's saying there, if every time somebody in another church makes a mistake, we publish something about it and attack them for it, and then we put them in the defensive that they have to defend themselves, maybe we're creating some of the friction. And maybe if we just closed our eyes and didn't, magnify everything and focused on the really big issues and didn't get drawn into personalities and arguments, maybe we'd be better off. Then he concludes, I also believe that in our fight, we may and shall give up nothing of the doctrine itself. We too often forget that we could win over sincere people and could better help those who are on the way toward us by proceeding in a friendly manner which recognizes the good that shows itself developing here and there, and so move them to the right point of view. And Walther could often write similar things, but I think a lot of the balance and the concern for method of reaching people flows from Wyneken, considerable part of it. And then he talks about the fact there's always a danger in the church that the pupils will try to be more Waltherian than Walther, or more Luther than Lutheran, and whatever, and that young people who have heard the rules but don't understand the principles kind of lose sight of what's the principle behind this, and they get so taken up with the rule. And so he says, I am concerned about some of our young pastors. And of course, if he's concerned about the young pastors, indirectly that's kind of a criticism of Walther, or a concern about where are they getting this attitude. He says, by acting in this manner, we would, it seems to me, at least avoid a dangerous reef. Namely, the younger brothers too often fall into a rigorousness. This rigorousness does not have its proper basis in clear understanding and practical experience of pure doctrine, but in the conceit that we are Missourian, we have the pure doctrine, and thus we are to be masters of other people. Then he also says, one of the knocks on me is that I, on the other hand, push synodical projects too hard. And he says, I plead guilty to that. He said, I'm an evangelist, I'm a missionary. I used to see when people lived in a log cabin and gave a lot of money to the seminary, now they're living in nice houses. And they don't support the seminary, they don't support missions, they don't help our pastors on the frontier. So he said, if I'm accused of being too taken up in projects, he said, I'll plead guilty to that. He said, that's my nature, and that's the way it is with me in the gospel. The sense of our forefathers was to limit themselves in their own spending and to live moderately, but demonstrate generosity in common affairs, the buildings of public buildings, churches, city halls, festivals, and so forth. It is the opposite way among us. We often like to think, well, in the good old days, everything was great, and now we have all these stewardship programs, and we have short budgets and everything. He's writing in the mid-1800s, and he said people have lost their first love. They're only 25 years old as a synod, and he said people have begun to lose their first love and have less enthusiasm for the role of the church than they did in the early years. The second to last paragraph just talks about occasional disagreements, but it was the doctrine of justification that always kept them together. He has great essays in here on justification. And then the 1841 sermon, which I didn't read much of it. I don't think I'm going to read much of it because he has only 3 sermons that survive in writing. He typically preached an hour and a half, and we only have an hour. And he typically preached from notes. But the dramatic change is really illustrated by that sermon. In that sermon, he basically said, we should never leave a heterodox church. We should always stay and fight. And Walther kind of felt that way for a while. Maybe they had a little guilty conscience. And he says, the principle is we should always stay. That church was there. The church was built. It has given us a lot. We should not leave it. That's what he wrote when he first came to America. We read what he was saying about defending the truth at the end. And an interesting topic is how were the views of fellowship developed in the Missouri Synod? I don't think their principles ever changed, but they came to a realization that the people we're dealing with that we thought were weak brothers really aren't, and we can't deal with them that way anymore. And so he always would maybe have done it in a much gentler, quiet way than Walther. He didn't disagree at all with the principle that there had to be unity based on all the doctrines of Scripture, but he was troubled by the tone in which Missouri did it. The other point where these writings are interesting to us is that the great controversy of the time, one of them was church and ministry. They had that with Grabo and then also with Leah. And there's a common idea that there was a Missouri Synod view of church and ministry and there was a Wisconsin Synod view of church and ministry. And the Missouri Synod view sort of emphasized the pastor as the only divinely inspired office and the congregation as the only form established by God. And I guess one of the most interesting things that I've learned in reading Walther and now Wyneken is that this is simply not at all true. And we used to kind of say that our Wauwatosa men, kind of had new insights into church and ministry or recovered new insights. I no longer believe that that's true. I think they were pretty much just following what people like Walther and Wyneken had taught them, whose view was exactly the same. And so rather than reading one of his sermons, I'll read one of his sections. A great priority of his, with his mission spirit and everything, was the priesthood of all believers. And of course, he also believed in upholding the public ministry. But he talks a lot about the priesthood of all believers and the importance of congregations and the importance of people upholding the ministry, the priesthood of all believers that God has given to them. So this is one of his first addresses to the synod after he was synod president. This is 1852. And the name of his address is, "We will not tolerate any Lutheran little pope." And so then he is going to go on to talk about it and what his view of the church and ministry is. First, I'm going to read you just a little quotation that tells about, I guess we can call this the miracle on the prairie of the growth of Lutheranism. This is how he starts out. "It's nothing but a miracle that just a few years ago there were only few German Lutheran preachers here and there fighting their way through forests and prairies. With great difficulty they visited the scattered members of their church and sparingly ministered to them with the bread of life. Today a synod is assembled that has more than 100 workers, preachers, professors, and teachers in the vineyard of the Lord. The longer the synod exists, the more congregations join. They rejoice with the synod that the light of true doctrine has been placed on the lampstand. Its living beams brighten hearts that love the truth. God has not only provided two institutions led by faithful and capable brothers, we also have men, and this is very interesting, can't quite agree with all his mission methodology, we have men with more modest ability to bear the name of the Lord among the heathen Indians. So the idea that you don't need as much ability to be a foreign missionary among relatively uncultured people, we say they hadn't fully come to grasp with all the realities of world mission theory. The zeal was there, but maybe there were still a couple things to learn. We must indeed boast the Lord has truly done great things to us. Also this past year he has done great things to us. Then he's going to talk a little bit about the issue of church and ministry. And I'll just read a couple parts of that because they're very interesting in light of present and later controversies. So what does he think is really at the heart of the ministry of the Word in the Lutheran confessions? And this is what he says. I believe that in this heavenly kingdom there is only one estate, the general estate of every Christian. There is no other office than that which is common to all Christians. He didn't make that up, of course. He's just quoting Luther. We further believe that this one, in its essence, undivided church, the communion of believers, without the distinction of so-called clergy and laity, is the heavenly bride. This was an address given to the synod, and as far as I know, nobody stood up and shouted, Wisconsinism, Wisconsinism, or anything like that when this statement was made. It was sort of understood. Indeed, as a king and priest, the prophet born of God, he's talking about the lay person, he is clothed with the highest worth and the highest office. There is no higher office or honor in Christianity. The clergy cannot be essentially higher than the laity. He is dignified by the Lord and his congregation to be placed as the householder, guard, watchman, governor of this divine heavenly doctrine of grace. I'm skipping some stuff now. The scriptures and the confessions most definitively teach that the Christian church, there is no essentially different office than that to which we are all called in holy baptism. And again, this was an address to the Synod Convention. This church determines, maintains, and advocates that the public exercise of this office, which is common to all, must be conferred to an individual who is found suitable for it and properly called according to the order and institution of the church. In essence, she is the bride of Christ and the ruler of all. In essence, she is made up completely of kings, priests, and prophets. With respect to the order, she is to be subject to the public preaching office. In essence, she has all the treasures of the kingdom of heaven. And he said that's what we stand for as a church, and that is what we want to defend. And so really what he's saying there is what some people have called wrongly the Wisconsin Synod view of church and ministry. It's really the confessions and the Lutheran view of church and ministry. And so this brief collection, I think we could say, identifies Wyneken as one of the great men of American Lutheranism. He wasn't a dogmatician, but he was a very good theologian. He was a great missionary, and in many ways he was, I think, an influence that not only promoted missions in the Missouri Synod, but also strongly promoted an evangelical approach. Walther certainly had that. But human nature being what it is, I think Walther sometimes benefited by Wyneken reminding him of what he really believed and said, you know, we need to practice a little bit more what we believe in principle. We have to put that evangelical thing into practice also with the people who maybe haven't fully treated us rightly either, and they had these ideas of conflicts. And so I think he certainly rates as one of the great men of American Lutheranism. We're about at our time, which is 10 o'clock. We can take a few questions, and the church history professors here will be happy to answer them if you have some, because I'm not a church historian. If you have some questions about the Philistines or Iron Age Israel, I'll be happy to entertain them, but we can should we take a couple minutes for questions or comments? Maybe some of the historians want to comment on their own perspective, having looked at it more than I did. but we're about at our appointed 10 o'clock hour. Yes?
The book, where did you say you could purchase it again?
I purchased it right from the publisher, which, what does it say in here? Actually, I think they gave it to me because they wanted me to review it in the quarterly, which is called Lutheran Legacy. And so now I think I would look first of all at the Concordia website and see if it's there. Do you know? Is it out by Concordia yet? I heard that that the second edition was available from Concordia. So I would start by looking at the Concordia website, I think. And the name of it is called At Home in the House of My Fathers.
Can you tell me what was the purpose of when Walther and Wyneken went back to Germany?
Well, part of the purpose, what was the purpose of their trip to Germany? Part of it was to get funds and support. Part of it was to deal with their understanding that they knew the fellowship with various people there, and especially with Leah, was beginning to fray. At times, trips that were for their health and rest were kind of, which was the chicken and the egg? Did they go for personal reasons and then do these other things, or did they go for the other reasons? So raising support, getting people to support the Lutheran Church in America in its dire conditions, to try to solve the problems that they recognized were coming between them and the people that were back in Germany, and at sometimes personal issues and health. In the account, they talk about how they visited their hometowns and visited people and family members, visited pastors that were still in the state church that they felt were pretty confessional. One interesting story there that will be in the article, Walther was asked to preach in a church that still had ties with the Union by the pastor. And Walther didn't feel in good conscience he can do it, but he kind of felt like often we get into those fellowship situations. And so he said, no, I can't really preach in a Union church. He said, the only way I could ever preach in the Union church is if you publicly allowed me to denounce the Union from the pulpit. And the pastor said, okay. And so now Walther is stuck. He said, I can't preach here unless you will let me denounce the Union from the pulpit. And the guy said, okay. And so I don't think Walther was violating his principles to preach in a Union church. Sometimes they'll say he preached in a Union church. Well, he did, but he preached in a Union church on the condition that he could publicly declare what was unscriptural about the Union. So there's really a lot of interesting illustrations of principles in this book. Another question.
It's interesting what you say about the polemics between the Missouri Synod back then and influenced his response to all of this liberalism or union?
Yes, because Walther targeted a lot of nasty polemics, very much so, from especially the Grabau party, but others, and even after they had kind of the falling out with Iowa and so on. So he was on the receiving end of a lot of things. One of our comforting things is whenever people are attacking the WELS, there was a man named Häfling who had kind of a view where you might wonder whether he really believed in the divine institution of pastoral ministry. And so they always called Walther a Häflingite. And so we're not in such bad company if they call us Häflingites. And so there was lots of harsh polemics against him. I don't think from us really. From us, I think we were a little bit peeved maybe that we felt the Missourians were too hard on us. But I don't think we really, when there was a dispute in a local congregation, the two local pastors might have gotten in each other's hair. But I don't think WELS really ever attacked Walther.
Yeah, what you're saying is very accurate. And that's like getting involved with a pit bull. But before that, he would be a puppy dog. But if you attacked him and said you're teaching false doctrine, or if you attacked him personally, then you had a fight on your hands.
This will be part of the fellowship article also in January. Our Augsburg Confession tries every possible way to be conciliatory to Roman Catholicism. Luther probably wouldn't have written it that way even in 1530, but 7 years later, in the small called articles, Luther is very strong and very, very blunt. And I sometimes say Walther, as they came toward the election controversy, kind of shifted from the Augsburg Confession mode to the small called article mode, and he did that in some individual cases, and not without reason. Ones he had thought were weak brothers weren't. Luther was willing for a while to think, well, Zwingli's a weak brother. He was disabused of that notion. And once he realized Zwingli wasn't really dealing honestly with him, he didn't have any more use for the guy.
Chairman, you know what part of Germany he came from?
No, you know what town he was from in Germany? I don't recall. It might be in here. I could look.
Somewhere in
Northern Germany. So the Pomeranians are trying to claim him as a Pomeranian. We'll let the Pomeranians have him as a Pomeranian.
I guess what has always struck me about the man is when he died, and that was 100 years before the WELS came to California. So it just shows you what a mission planner he was.
Well, another interesting line, I couldn't do all of them, of course. He was out in California in this real health crisis. He went out there, and he was kind of still a pastor in Cleveland, kind of, and he was out in California, and he's kind of saying, well, I think I'm dying, and, you know, probably the end of the road for me, and I'm pretty useless. I'm not doing any good to the congregation back in Cleveland. I guess I'll have to go down and see what kind of mission work I can do in the San Francisco area. So he probably would have had them carry him on his stretcher, you know, down to San Francisco at least to try to see if I can't do it, you know, what are some things we should be doing out here, and I can get some of the young guys on it. So even when he's, you know, at death's door, he's out in California, and all he can see is not the gold fields, but the harvest that's there. So a great mission spirit.
Do you have any references from Wisconsin Synod people at the time about Wyneken?
No, the guy to ask, though, is Pastor Vic Prangy, because that family is kind of from his home base, right? Because he's always talking about the Wyneken house and stuff like that. So the Prangys, I don't know if they're actually relatives or their relatives are parishioners of Wyneken, something like that. So if you want to have the Wyneken family history and the Wyneken log cabin and everything, he's way down in Arizona, but probably even one of the Prangys around here could probably tell you quite a bit about that connection. I think all the Prangys or Prangs all kind of came from that area, didn't they? Yeah, so they're the kind of the experts on that.
The author of the book again?
Well, Harrison is the editor, Matthew Harrison. He did a lot of the translating himself. It's basically, of course, the authors are the four presidents, but the translator, Matthew Harrison, who's now president of the Missouri Synod, is the primary editor, and he did a lot of the translating. He didn't do all of the translating, but he did quite a bit of it. Okay, we're kind of at our conclusion, I guess. We'll be around here if you want to ask me some questions after, but kind of advertise 9 to 10. Do you have further announcements? You want the mic here?
I certainly want to thank you again for coming. I know when I asked Professor Brug to give a presentation to the WELS Historical Institute, his first reaction was, well, I'm not much of a historian, but you did an excellent job here today, and I really do thank you for coming. And anyone who says that we should give Wisconsin a break, I think is in my top 5 of great Lutheran leaders. So excellent presentation, extremely interesting. We have 2 more presentations coming. We have one next Saturday and then the following Saturday. They're all at 9 o'clock. So next Saturday, I believe Pastor Mark Wagner is coming to give a presentation. And then the final one is by Professor Mark Brown.